The entire dojo went silent when the black belt wrapped his arm around the woman's neck and lifted her partly from the floor. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to interfere. He was a celebrated champion, a man who had won tournaments across the state and built his reputation on making people afraid of him. But then an older man sitting quietly near the back of the room slowly stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply removed his jacket and looked at the champion with an expression so calm that the room suddenly felt colder. The black belt had no idea that the quiet stranger had spent years serving in one of the most demanding military units in the world. He had no idea that the man had survived missions where hesitation could cost lives. Most importantly, he didn't know that the veteran had spent years learning the hardest lesson of all: real strength isn't about hurting people. It's about knowing exactly when you must stand up for someone who cannot stand for herself. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and having the courage to protect someone who needs help, please like this video, share it with someone who believes in true strength, leave a comment, and subscribe to Dad's Soul Diaries. Because sometimes the person sitting quietly in the corner isn't weak at all. Sometimes they're simply waiting for the right moment to remind someone what strength really means. The woman's name was Elara Whitmore. She was 36 years old and had been training at the Riverside Martial Arts Center for nearly 2 years. She wasn't a champion. She wasn't particularly strong. She had joined the dojo after losing her husband and struggling to rebuild her confidence. Her husband, Nolan, had died suddenly, leaving Elara to raise their young daughter, Juniper, alone. Martial arts had initially been terrifying for her. She had been afraid of falling, afraid of making mistakes, and especially afraid of being judged. But every week she returned. She learned slowly. She stumbled. She bruised her knees. She forgot techniques and sometimes laughed at herself when she got them wrong. Yet she kept coming back because every time she stepped onto the mat, she felt a little stronger. The most intimidating person at the dojo was a black belt named Dorian Vance. He was 29, athletic, talented, and extremely confident. His trophies filled an entire shelf near the entrance. Younger students watched him with admiration, and many adults respected his skill. But Dorian had developed a dangerous habit. He enjoyed embarrassing people who were less experienced. He called it motivation. Everyone else called it bullying. He especially disliked Elara because she refused to be intimidated by him. She wasn't disrespectful, but she didn't treat him like a celebrity either. She simply wanted to train. One bright Saturday morning, the dojo was filled with sunlight coming through the tall windows. Children practiced footwork on one side of the room while advanced students trained near the mirrors. Elara was working through a basic defensive movement when Dorian walked past and stopped. He watched her attempt the technique 3 times. Each time she made a small mistake with her balance. Instead of offering help, he laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. Elara lowered her eyes, embarrassed, but continued practicing. A few minutes later, Dorian approached her. He corrected her position aggressively and told her she was wasting everyone's time. Elara apologized and said she was still learning. Dorian told her that people who were afraid to fight had no business stepping onto a martial arts mat. Several students looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything. Elara tried to continue. Then Dorian became more aggressive. He grabbed her arm and pulled her into a demonstration she hadn't agreed to participate in. Elara lost her balance. She fell. The room became quiet. She stood up slowly, embarrassed but determined not to cry. She told Dorian that she wanted to stop. He refused to let the moment end. He told her she needed to learn what happened when someone weaker challenged someone stronger. Before she could step away, he grabbed her around the neck. His grip tightened enough to frighten her, and panic flashed across her face. She tried to pull his arm away, but she couldn't. For several seconds, everyone froze. Then someone near the back of the room stood up. His name was Silas Mercer. Most people at the dojo knew almost nothing about him. He was 54 years old, broad-shouldered but slightly weathered, with silver beginning to show in his dark hair. He had been attending the dojo for several weeks because he wanted to stay active after retiring. He usually arrived early, sat quietly near the wall, and left before most people noticed him. He wore simple training clothes and never discussed his career. Dorian didn't even recognize him as a threat. Silas walked toward them. His voice was calm. He told Dorian to let her go. Dorian looked at him and laughed. He asked whether the old man planned to teach him a lesson. Silas didn't answer. He looked directly at Elara and told her to breathe. Then he looked at Dorian. He repeated the instruction. Dorian finally released Elara, but instead of stepping away, he shoved her toward the mat. That was the moment Silas moved. He didn't attack with anger. He didn't swing wildly. He simply stepped between them. Dorian attempted to push past him. Silas redirected him. The black belt suddenly found his balance disappearing beneath him. He stumbled. Silas caught his arm, turned with his momentum, and brought him down under control. The entire movement lasted only seconds. Dorian stared at the floor in disbelief. Silas released him immediately. There was no celebration. No insult. No smile. Silas simply told him that the situation was over. Dorian stood up slowly. His pride had been wounded more deeply than his body. He demanded to know who Silas thought he was. Silas looked at him. He said that his name didn't matter. Dorian stepped closer. He told Silas that he had no idea who he was dealing with. Silas remained silent for a moment. Then he quietly said that Dorian should be careful about saying those words. Because the truth was that Silas had spent most of his life trying to forget exactly who he used to be. Silas had served in Delta Force. The revelation stunned the room. He had never told anyone because he didn't want admiration. His military career had been filled with experiences he couldn't easily explain. He had served overseas, operated in dangerous environments, and spent years learning how to remain calm when everyone around him was afraid. He had lost friends. He had returned home carrying memories that followed him into quiet rooms and sleepless nights. After leaving the military, Silas deliberately chose an ordinary life. He repaired antique furniture. He volunteered at a community center. He trained at the dojo. He avoided attention. He didn't want people asking what he had done. He wanted people to see who he was now. But that morning, he couldn't remain seated while someone was being hurt. Dorian didn't believe the story. He challenged Silas to prove it. Silas refused. He told Dorian that he wasn't there to fight him. Dorian became angry. He said that if Silas really was who he claimed to be, then he should have nothing to fear. Silas looked at him and said something that nobody in the room expected. He told Dorian that he was afraid. Not of Dorian. He was afraid of becoming the person he had once been. That sentence silenced the room. Silas explained that during his military years, violence had sometimes been necessary. But after returning home, he realized how easily people could become addicted to the feeling of control. He had seen men confuse fear with respect. He had seen people become cruel because they were terrified of appearing weak. He told Dorian that he had spent years learning how to control his hands. But controlling his heart had been much harder. Elara was sitting against the wall, still shaken. Silas walked over and asked if she was okay. She nodded. Then she thanked him. Silas told her she didn't owe him anything. He had simply done what anyone should have done. But Elara disagreed. She told him that everyone had watched. Only he had stood up. Silas didn't know what to say. Because she was right. The dojo's head instructor, Master Renwick Hale, had been away when the incident began. He returned shortly afterward and watched the security footage. He immediately suspended Dorian from training pending an investigation. Dorian's reputation began collapsing. Students who had admired him started telling stories about previous incidents. Parents complained. Several people admitted they had been afraid to speak because they didn't want to become his next target. Dorian suddenly realized that the problem wasn't one bad moment. It was a pattern. He had spent years building an image of strength while becoming weaker inside. But Silas did something unexpected. He asked Master Renwick not to destroy Dorian's future. The instructor was surprised. Silas explained that consequences were necessary, but humiliation wouldn't teach Dorian anything. If Dorian genuinely wanted to change, there should be a path back. Dorian couldn't understand why Silas would help him after what had happened. Silas told him that forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetting. It meant giving someone the opportunity to become better while still holding them accountable for what they had done. Dorian eventually agreed to counseling and anger management training. He was required to assist beginner students under supervision and apologize personally to those he had mistreated. The first apology was difficult. The second was worse. The third broke him. He realized how many people had walked away from martial arts because he had made them feel worthless. One of them was Elara. Months passed. Elara continued training. She became stronger. Not physically at first. Emotionally. She stopped apologizing every time she made a mistake. She stopped looking at the floor when someone corrected her. She learned to stand tall. And eventually, she earned her first belt. It wasn't black. It wasn't impressive. But when Silas saw her wearing it, he smiled. Elara had earned something far more important than a colored belt. She had earned confidence. One afternoon, Dorian approached her after class. He apologized. Elara listened. She didn't immediately forgive him. She told him she needed time. Dorian accepted that. For the first time, he understood that forgiveness wasn't something he could demand. He had to earn trust. And slowly, he did. He began helping younger students. He became patient. He learned to encourage beginners instead of mocking them. He discovered that teaching someone to succeed felt better than defeating them. Silas watched the transformation quietly. One evening, Dorian asked Silas why he had protected him from losing everything. Silas told him that nobody had protected him from his own mistakes when he was young. He had learned some lessons the hardest way possible. He didn't want Dorian to repeat that journey. Dorian asked whether Silas believed he could really change. Silas said that change wasn't something you announced. It was something you demonstrated every day. Years later, Elara became one of the dojo's assistant instructors. Her daughter, Juniper, eventually began training too. She was fearless in a way her mother had never been. Silas remained part of the dojo community. He still sat near the wall sometimes. He still avoided talking about his military service. But everyone understood what he represented. Not a warrior. Not a hero. A man who had survived a violent world and had chosen peace when he finally had the freedom to choose. Dorian eventually became an instructor himself. His students knew him as demanding but compassionate. When someone made a mistake, he never laughed. He remembered the woman on the mat. He remembered the fear in her eyes. And he remembered the quiet veteran who stood up. One day, a young student asked Dorian why he had changed. Dorian looked across the dojo at Silas. Then he smiled. He said that once, he thought being strong meant making people afraid. Then someone stronger taught him otherwise. The student asked who. Dorian pointed toward Silas. Silas shook his head and smiled. He didn't want credit. He never had. The years had taught him that the greatest victories weren't the ones people applauded. They were the quiet moments when someone chose not to become cruel. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to Dad's Soul Diaries. Every interaction helps these stories reach people who may need a reminder that courage can be quiet and that kindness can be stronger than fear. And before the ending, I have one special request. Comment "Real strength protects" if you believe that true strength isn't about intimidating people, but about standing up for those who need someone brave enough to help them. Years later, Elara stood in the same dojo where everything had changed.